Question. Could you please tell us more about your experiences with psychotherapy? The reason I ask is that I'm being treated by 2 therapists and a Reiki healer. But one of the therapists has raised a concern that I risk having a crisis because of more than one person digging up my psyche. I feel it is an intense experience indeed, but a sustainable one for me because I have a lot of experience going through contrasting states of mind in this life, so I accept the risk. You mentioned that you did many different types of therapy, so I wonder if you were doing them in parallel or sequentially. Please share anything. I believe it will help and encourage many people. Okay, so let's just start with a question there. Should you do more than one kind of therapy or use more than one kind of therapist at the same time? And I don't think, when I think back, that I actually did it at the same time. I focused on one thing at a time. So that's what I would recommend for most people. I'm not saying for all people, because if the person who's writing the question feels that he or she can handle it, then okay, that's fine. I mean, I don't inherently see any problem with more than one person digging up my psyche. I don't really see any big problem with that, because they could have different approaches, different viewpoints on it. And what often happens in therapy, and this is, I think it goes for all kinds of therapy, and it ties in with this old American saying, if the only tool you have is a hammer, you think every problem is a nail. And if you look at therapists, I know that there's a sort of, what I picked up over the years, there's a certain collective illusion in the therapeutic community that we have the best form of therapy and we should be able to help everybody. I'm not saying everybody has this, but many people have it. But in reality, each therapist has their individual approach to therapy. And it will help some people and not all people. So this means that there could very well be that you are working on a particular problem in your psyche. And one person looks at it this way, and that therapist wants you to continue to try and resolve the problem that way. But you may need a different viewpoint in order to resolve it, because you're not quite seeing the underlying psychology. And as another person might give you that. And so I'm not necessarily hereby recommending that people use 2 forms of therapy, but what I will say when I look back at my personal approach to this, I was always, in a sense, doing more than one thing, because I wasn't just going to a therapist. I was also studying the teachings of the Ascended Masters, who talk about psychology, and I was studying popular books on psychology. I remember back in the early 1990s, when I started going into therapy, I was reading Ascended Master teachings, and I was reading M. Scott Peck, The Road Less Traveled, and The People of the Lie, and several other books that were popular at that time. They're probably forgotten now. Okay, so let me just ask, could you please tell us more about your experience with psychotherapy? So in the early, probably it was 1990, maybe going into 91, I decided that it was time to really work on my psychology. And I was fortunate, because I was in the Summit Lighthouse at the time. There was a licensed and experienced psychotherapist, traditional psychotherapist, who had been on staff at the Summit Lighthouse. She started doing private sessions. And so I went to her, and she had traditional education in psychotherapy, had practiced that for years, but she had also looked into EMDR and Gestalt therapy. So we actually, over the course of the, 6-8 months I was did weekly sessions, we used talk therapy, Gestalt, and EMDR. Not in the same session, but we came to a problem and she said, okay, let's try Gestalt here. My father, for example, 2 chairs. I'm sitting in one chair. I am now myself telling my father all the things some of the things I never got to tell him. And then I switched to the other chair, and now I'm responding like I think my father might have responded. That was powerful, because all of a sudden I started seeing my father more as a human being. So, and then we had some other things where we did the EMDR. She was moving her hand. I would follow it with my eyes. I know there are different forms of EMDR. And then we would talk about it. We would talk about it before, we would do the EMDR, we would talk about it afterwards. And so I did that for, I think, 6 to 8 months, one session a week. And it helped me a lot. We actually came to a point where we both kind of felt we'd gone as far as we needed to go, at least at that time. But it didn't mean that I stopped working on my psychology. I also, over time, used various other tools, hypnotherapy, but it wasn't hypnosis, it was guided meditation. And I used other forms, I can't even remember them. It was just, I was in this community where there were people that were, inner child work. I did inner child work as well. I actually think I did inner child work at the same time. I did an inner child workshop at the same time I was going to the therapist. So I don't know how relevant this is for others, because this therapist I use is no longer in embodiment. And how many people can you find who is a licensed therapist, who has a spiritual outlook on life, and who is willing to use different modalities? But you can at least, if you can't find a person who has a spiritual outlook on life, you can at least find somebody, hopefully, who will respect your spiritual outlook and will help you within the context of your spiritual beliefs, and respect those beliefs, and just look at it as, if this helps my patient, then it's okay. So hopefully you should be able to find that if you feel like you need to go into therapy. I will say, though, that, as I said, this was back in the 1990s, early 1990s. My therapist and I, we felt we've gone as far as we can go. I had a very profound session, the last session, where she really felt, and I felt as well, that it was like, she described it as my Christ self descended and really bonded with me, and I had reached clearly a higher level. But this was, let's say it was 92, and I've gone through an awful lot of psychology since then. And so most of my psychological healing, I mean, I clearly had a benefit from psychotherapy, clearly had a benefit from it. But most of my psychological healing has happened gradually over time by this constant self-introspective process that I've actually been doing all of my life. And I just gradually become more conscious of it, asking myself these questions like, why do I react this way? Why do I believe this way? And really, if I look back at it, yes, it was important for me to have outer therapists because they have a different perspective on your mind or your psychology than you do. But the real psychotherapist that I have been using has been the Ascended Masters. Because up through the 90s, and I think the initial therapy was important for giving me a better intuitive connection with the Masters than I had before. I don't doubt that at all. But after I was done with the therapy, I used the Masters and used my intuition and asked them questions. And I would always, it was almost like the shift that I went through, and I can't really pinpoint a specific incident, but the shift that I went through is actually what I've talked about in a lot of my videos, where I realized the importance of resolving psychology, that this is the essence of the spiritual path. And therefore, in the back of my mind, there was always this process of, whenever I encountered a situation, I looked at my reactions. Why am I reacting? And I intuitively often felt, oh, here's a book, let me read that. So I was reading a book and I was always looking at myself, where does this apply to me? can I see a pattern in my own psychology based on what's described in the book? Then I would explore it and look at it. I would ask the masters, help me see it. And so many times, even up through the 90s, I felt that I received a lot of insights from the masters. And then in 2002, I started working, as I described, with Jesus to do the Ask Will Jesus website. And he took me also through a process, a very intense process of overcoming some things. But even after that, after I became a messenger for the Ascended Masters, there's still been this constant process. Looking at myself, observing myself, not in a judgmental way, you understand. And not in a deficit way, but just what do I need to look at next? It's not that, there came a point where I stopped, and this probably actually started happening as a result of my therapy, where I didn't feel I was deficient in somehow. I mean, so many people are, even so many spiritual people, we have difficulty functioning in life, and I had that when I was younger. I really had difficulty relating to society, functioning in society. I mean, it wasn't that I couldn't hold a job or anything, but I just didn't feel I fit in anywhere. And many spiritual people are like this. So we have sort of a deficit in our psychology. And I overcame that after the therapy, but that didn't mean that I now started thinking I'd resolved all of my psychology. It was just now I started looking at my psychology without the deficit, without having to judge myself. And I was much more willing to look at my psychology. There were still certain things that I couldn't look at because, as I've explained before, it's a process. And you look at the more superficial surface things first, and then you gradually go deeper where things become much more subtle. And the subtler they are, the more time it usually takes before you have the insight that shifts you. And, this has been going on. And then it was going up through the 2000s, but then when I started getting these teachings, I think it was 2017 really, about the subconscious selves and the cosmic burst trauma and avatars, it went up to another level. And I really used those teachings to really overcome some very deep stuff. And that has helped me come to the point where in the last 2 years I'm just more at peace with myself, peace with being on earth and doing what I'm doing. And where am I going with this? What does it have to do with the question, my experiences with psychotherapy? Well, psychotherapy is a process of healing. There's really, what I'm saying is, psychotherapy is a name for a specific method, one particular method, one particular approach to healing psychology. But beyond psychotherapy, EMDR, hypnotherapy, Gestalt, this or that, beyond all of this is the process of resolving psychology. And that's what matters. So what matters for you is that you use whatever means are available to you to come to that shift that I said, where you're not having the deficit. You're not dysfunctional. You can function in the world. You can function in society. And then instead of thinking, this is it, now I've resolved everything, you realize this is now when you really can start working on the deeper layers of your psychology. And you do that by, you can use therapy if you feel like it, but you do it by looking at yourself, asking the Ascended Masters for help, using your intuition, and stimulating your intuition by reading books. And again, therapy can also stimulate your intuition. But it really is an internal process. And so what I'm saying is, it's like, most people are, of course, not working on their psychology whatsoever. Most of the people I grew up with, they were not working on their psychology. They still aren't, those that are still alive. But you can overcome that. You come to realize you can benefit from working on your psychology. But still, then you go through a phase where you are working on specific problems, specific issues. And then you overcome that sense of deficit, of not really functioning. Now you are a functioning individual. And that actually starts the deeper process of where now you don't necessarily need the therapist. You might still benefit from it, but you don't really need it, because if you have some intuitive connection to the Ascended Masters and you're willing to look at yourself, it becomes internally driven. It's like a self-reinforcing process. It's like you have to accelerate yourself beyond a certain point. And then from there, it's a sustainable process. It doesn't always go with the same speed. Sometimes it takes a while to break through, but it becomes a self-sustained process. And when I say that, I don't mean, I realize, I don't mean that you're doing it by yourself, because your outer self can't resolve itself. But what I mean is that instead of having an external therapist in this world helping you, you have the Ascended Masters who are helping you internally through your intuition. And to me, that's the real process of psychological healing. And I think in a sense I was always working with the Ascended Masters, I just wasn't as conscious of it. And they inspired me to go to therapy. And it helped me increase my intuition, my connection with them, to the point where I didn't need the therapy. Now I could. But if I got an intuitive impulse that I should go into therapy again, I would do it. I mean, I would do it any time. But it would have to come more from within rather than the outer mind deciding it. So I don't know if this helps anybody, but you can ask me further questions if there's something you want me to clarify.